Morning. Committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. Good morning. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Welcome to each of you. This is a public hearing of the Benghazi Select Committee. Just a couple of quick administrative matters before we start, Madam Secretary. There are predetermined breaks, but I want to make it absolutely clear we can take a break for any reason or for no reason. If you or anyone would just simply alert me, then we will take a break, and it can be for any reason or for no reason. To our guests, we are happy to have you here. The witness deserves to hear the questions, and the members deserve to hear the answers. So proper decorum must be observed at all times. No reaction to questions or answers. No disruptions. Some committees take an incremental approach to decorum. I do not. This is your one and only notice. Madam Secretary, the ranking member and I will give opening statements, and then you will be recognized for your opening statement. And then after that, the members will all try to make it better. And it cost them their lives. So we know what they gave us. What do we owe them? Justice for those that killed them. We owe their families our everlasting gratitude, respect. We owe them and each other the truth about why we were in Libya, the truth about what we were doing in Libya, the truth about the escalating violence in Libya before we were attacked and these 4 men were killed, the truth about requests for additional security, the truth about requests for additional personnel, the truth about requests for additional equipment, the truth about where and why our military was positioned as it was on the anniversary of 9/11. The truth about what was happening and being discussed in Washington while our people were under attack. The truth about what led to the attacks, and the truth about what our government told the American people after the attacks. Why were there so many requests for more security personnel and equipment, and why were those requests denied in Washington? Why did the State Department, compound and facility, not even come close to meeting proper security specifications? What policies were we pursuing in Libya that required a physical presence in spite of the escalating violence? Who in Washington was aware of the escalating violence? What precautions, if any, were taken on the anniversary of 9/11? What happened in Washington after the first attack still lingered, and these questions lingered because previous investigations were not thorough. These questions lingered because those previous investigations were narrow in scope and either incapable or unwilling to access the facts and evidence necessary to answer all relevant questions. So the House of Representatives, including some Democrats, I hasten to add, asked this committee to write the final definitive accounting of what happened in Benghazi. This committee is the first committee to review more than 50,000 pages of documents because we insisted that they be produced. This committee is the first committee to demand access to more eyewitnesses because serious investigations talk to as many eyewitnesses as possible. This committee is the first committee to thoroughly and individually interview scores of other witnesses, many of them for the first time. This committee is the first committee to review thousands of pages of documents from top State Department personnel. This committee is the first committee to demand access to relevant documents from the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense, and even the White House. This committee is the first committee to demand access to the emails to and from Ambassador Chris Stevens. How could an investigation possibly be considered serious without reviewing the emails of the person most knowledgeable about Libya? This committee is the first committee, the only committee, to uncover the fact that Secretary Clinton exclusively used personal email on her own personal server for official business and kept the public record, including emails about Benghazi and Libya, in her own custody and control for almost 2 years after she left office. You will hear a lot today about the Accountability Review Board. Secretary Clinton has mentioned it more than 70 times in her previous testimony before Congress. But when you hear about the ARB, you should also know the State Department leadership handpicked the members of the ARB. The ARB never interviewed Secretary Clinton. The ARB never reviewed her emails. And Secretary Clinton's top advisor was allowed to review and suggest changes to the ARB before the public ever saw it. There's no transcript of the ARB interviews, so it's impossible to know whether all relevant questions were asked and answered. And because there's no transcript, it is also impossible to cite the ARB interviews with any particularity at all. That is not independent. That is not accountability. That is not a serious investigation. You will hear there were previous congressional investigations into Benghazi, and that is true. And it should make you wonder why those investigations failed to interview so many witnesses and access so many documents. If those previous congressional investigations were really serious and thorough, how did they miss Ambassador Stevens' emails? If those previous investigations were serious and thorough, how did they miss Secretary Clinton's emails? If those congressional investigations really were serious and thorough, why did they fail to interview dozens of key State Department witnesses, including agents on the ground who experienced the attacks firsthand? Just last month, 3 years after Benghazi, top aides finally returned documents to the State Department. A month ago, this committee received 1,500 new pages of Secretary Clinton's emails related to Libya and Benghazi, 3 years after the attacks. And a little over 2 weeks ago, this committee received nearly 1,400 pages of Ambassador Stevens' emails, 3 years after the attacks. It is impossible to conduct a serious, fact-centric investigation without access to the documents from the former Secretary of State, the ambassador who knew more about Libya than anyone else, and testimony from witnesses who survived the attacks. Madam Secretary, I understand there are people, frankly, in both parties who have suggested that this investigation is about you. Let me assure you it is not, and let me assure you why it is not. This investigation is about 4 people who were killed representing our country on foreign soil. It is about what happened before, during, and after the attacks that killed them. It is about what this country owes to those who risk their lives to serve it. And it is about the fundamental obligation of government to tell the truth, always, to the people that it purports to. Madam Secretary, not a single member of this committee signed up to investigate you or your email. We signed up to investigate and therefore honor the lives of 4 people that we sent into a dangerous country to represent us, and to do everything we can to prevent it from happening to others. Our committee has interviewed 100 witnesses. Not a single one of them has been named Clinton until today. You were the Secretary of State for this country at all relevant times, so the committee is going to want to talk to you. You are an important witness. You are one important witness among 100 important witnesses. And I do understand you wanted to come sooner than today, so let me be clear why that did not happen. You had an unusual email arrangement, which meant the State Department could not produce your emails to us. You made exclusive use of personal email and a personal server. And when you left the State Department, you kept the public record to yourself for almost 2 years. And it was you and your attorneys who decided what to return and what to delete. Those decisions were your decisions, not our decisions. It was only in March of this year we learned of this email arrangement. And since we learned of this email arrangement, we have interviewed dozens of witnesses, only one of whom was solely related to your email arrangement. And that was the shortest interview of all, because that witness invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against incrimination. Making sure the public record is complete is what serious investigations do, so it was important and remains important that this committee have access to all of Ambassador Stevens' emails, the emails of other senior leaders and witnesses, and it is important to gain access to all of your emails, Madam Secretary. Your emails are no less or no more important than the emails of anyone else. It just took us a little bit longer to get them, and it garnered a little more attention in the process. I want you to take note during this hearing how many times congressional Democrats call on this administration to make long-awaited documents available to us. They won't. Take note of how many witnesses congressional Democrats ask us to schedule for interview. They won't. We would be much closer to finding out what happened and writing the final definitive report if Democrats on this committee had helped us just a little bit pursue the facts. But if the Democrats on this committee had their way, dozens of witnesses never would have been interviewed. Your public record would still be private. Thousands of documents never would have been accessed, and we wouldn't have the emails of our own ambassador. That may be smart politics, but it is a lousy way to run a serious investigation. There are certain characteristics that make our country unique in the annals of history. We are the greatest experiment in self-governance the world has ever known. And part of that self-governance comes self-scrutiny, even of the highest officials. Our country is strong enough to handle the truth, and our fellow citizens expect us to pursue the truth wherever the facts take us. So this committee is going to do what we pledged to do and what should have been done, frankly, a long time ago, which is interview all relevant witnesses, examine all relevant evidence, and access all relevant documents. And we're going to pursue the truth in a manner worthy of the memory of the 4 people who lost their lives and worthy of the respect of our fellow citizens. And we are going to write that final definitive accounting of what happened in Benghazi. And we would like to do it with your help and the help of our Democrat colleagues, but make no mistake, we are going to do it nonetheless, because understanding what happened in Benghazi goes to the heart of who we are as a country and the promises we make to those that we send into harm's way. They deserve the truth. They deserve the whole truth. They deserve nothing but the truth. The people we work for deserve the truth. The friends and family of the 4 who lost their lives deserve the truth. We're going to find the truth because there is no statute of limitations on the truth. With that, I would recognize my friend from Maryland.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Madam Secretary, I want to thank you very much for being here today to testify before Congress on this very important issue. This is your 3rd time. This week, our chairman, Mr. Gowdy, was interviewed in a lengthy media profile. During his interview, he complained that he was, and I quote, he has an impossible job. That's what the chairman said, impossible job. He said, is it impossible to conduct a serious, fact-centric investigation in such a, quote, political environment? I have great respect for the chairman, but on this score, he is absolutely wrong. In fact, it has been done by his own Republican colleagues in the House on this very issue, Benghazi. The Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee conducted an extensive, bipartisan, 2-year investigation and issued a detailed report. The Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee also conducted a bipartisan investigation. Those bipartisan efforts respected and honored the memories of the 4 brave Americans who gave their lives in Benghazi. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty. The problem is that the Republican caucus did not like the answers they got from those investigations. So they set up this select committee with no rules, no deadline, and an unlimited budget. And they set them loose, Madam Secretary, because you're running for president. Clearly, it is possible to conduct a serious bipartisan investigation. What is impossible is for any reasonable person to continue denying that Republicans are squandering millions of taxpayer dollars on this abusive effort to derail Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign. In the chairman's interview, he tried to defend against this criticism by attempting to cast himself as the victim. And he complained about attacks on the credibility of the Select Committee. His argument would be more compelling if Republicans weren't leading the charge. As we all know, Representative Kevin McCarthy, Speaker Boehner's second in command, and the chairman's close friend admitted that they established the Select Committee to drive down Secretary Clinton's poll numbers. Democrats didn't say that. The second in command in the House said that, a Republican. Republican Congressman Richard Hanna said the Select Committee was, quote, designed to go after Secretary Clinton. And one of the chairman's own hand-picked investigators, a self-proclaimed conservative Republican, charged that he was fired in part for not going along with these plans to, quote, hyper-focus on Hillary Clinton, end of quote. These stark admissions reflect exactly what we have seen inside the Select Committee for the past year. Let's just take a look at the facts. Since January, Republicans have canceled every single hearing on our schedule for the entire year, except for this one, Secretary Clinton. They also canceled numerous interviews that they had planned with the Defense Department and the CIA officials. Instead of doing that, they said what they were going to do. Republicans zeroed in on Secretary Clinton, her speechwriters, her IT staffers, and her campaign officials. This is what the Republicans did, not the Democrats. When Speaker Boehner established this Select Committee, he justified it by arguing that it would, quote, cross jurisdictional lines. I assume he meant we would focus on more than just Secretary of State. But Madam Secretary, you're sitting there by yourself. The Secretary of Defense is not on your left. The Director of the CIA is not on your right. That's because Republicans abandoned their own plans to question those top officials. So instead of being cross-jurisdictional, Republicans just crossed them off the list. Last weekend, the chairman told the Republican colleagues to shut up and stop talking about the Select Committee. What I want to know is this, and this is a key question. Why tell the Republicans to shut up when they are telling the truth, but not when they are attacking Secretary Clinton with reckless accusations that are demonstrably false? Why not tell them to shut up then? Carly Fiorina has said that Secretary Clinton has blood on her hands. Mike Huckabee accused her of ignoring the warning calls from dying Americans in Benghazi. Senator Rand Paul said Benghazi was a 3 a.m. phone call that she never picked up. And Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, "Where the hell were you on the night of the Benghazi attack?" Everyone on this panel knows these accusations are baseless from our own investigation and all those before it. Yet, Republican members of this select committee remain silent. On Monday, the Democrats issued a report showing that none of the 54 witnesses the committee interviewed substantiated these wild Republican claims. Secretary Clinton did not order the military to stand down, and she neither approved nor denied requests for additional security. I ask that our report be included in the official record for today's hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
What is so telling is that we issued virtually the same report a year ago. Same report. When we first joined the Select Committee, I asked my staff to put together a complete report and database setting forth the questions that had been asked about the attacks and all of the answers that were provided in the 8 previous investigations. I ask that this report also be included in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
The problem is that rather than accepting these facts, Republicans continue to spin new conspiracy theories that are just as outlandish and inaccurate. For example, the chairman recently tried to argue that Sidney Blumenthal was Secretary Clinton's primary advisor on Libya. And this past Sunday, Representative Pompeo claimed on national television that Secretary Clinton relied on Sidney Blumenthal for most of her intelligence on Libya. Earlier this week, the Washington Post fact checker awarded this claim 4 Pinocchios, its worst rating. Here's the bottom line. The Select Committee has spent 17 months and $4.7 million of taxpayer money. We've held 4 hearings and conducted 54 interviews and depositions. Yes, we have received some new emails from Secretary Clinton, Ambassador Stevens, and others. And yes, we have conducted some new interviews. But these documents and interviews do not show any nefarious activity. In fact, it's just the opposite. The new information we have obtained confirms and corroborates the core facts we already knew from 8 previous investigations. They provide more detail, but they do not change the basic conclusions. It is time now for the Republicans to end this taxpayer-funded fishing expedition. We need to come together and shift from politics to policy. That's what the American people want, shifting from politics to policy. We need to finally make good on our promises to the families. And the families only asked us to do 3 things. 1, do not make this a political football. 2, find the facts. 3, do everything in your power to make sure that this does not happen again. And so we need to start focusing on what we here in Congress can do to improve the safety and security of our diplomatic corps in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman from Maryland. Madam Secretary, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of this committee. The terrorist attacks at our diplomatic compound and later at the CIA post in Benghazi, Libya on September 11th, 2012, took the lives of 4 brave Americans: Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods. I'm here to honor the service of those 4 men, the courage of the Diplomatic Security Agency and the CIA officers who risked their lives that night, and the work their colleagues do every single day all over the world. I knew and admired Chris Stevens. He was one of our nation's most accomplished diplomats. Chris's mother liked to say that he had sand in his shoes because he was always moving, always working, especially in the Middle East that he came to know so well. When the revolution broke out in Libya, we named Chris as our envoy to the opposition. There was no easy way to get him into Benghazi to begin gathering information and meeting those Libyans who were rising up against the murderous dictator Gaddafi. But he found a way to get himself there on a Greek cargo ship, just like a 19th century American envoy. But his work was very much 21st century hard-nosed diplomacy. It is a testament to the relationships that he built in Libya that on the day following the awareness of his death, tens of thousands of Libyans poured into the streets in Benghazi. They held signs reading, "Thugs don't represent Benghazi or Islam. Sorry, people of America, this is not the behavior of our Islam or our prophet." Chris Stevens, a friend to all Libyans. Although I didn't have the privilege of meeting Sean Smith personally, he was a valued member of our State Department family. An Air Force veteran, he was an information management officer who had served in Pretoria, Baghdad, Montreal, and The Hague. Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty worked for the CIA. They were killed by mortar fire at the CIA's outpost in Benghazi, a short distance from the diplomatic compound. They were both former Navy SEALs and trained paramedics with distinguished records of service, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. As Secretary of State, I had the honor to lead and the responsibility to support nearly 70,000 diplomats and development experts across the globe. Losing any one of them, as we did in Iraq, Afghanistan, Mexico, Haiti, and Libya, during my tenure was deeply painful for our entire State Department and USAID family, and for me personally. I was the one who asked Chris to go to Libya as our envoy. I was the one who recommended him to be our ambassador to the president. After the attacks, I stood next to President Obama as Marines carried his casket and those of the other 3 Americans off the plane at Andrews Air Force Base. I took responsibility. And as part of that, before I left office, I launched reforms to better protect our people in the field and help reduce the chance of another tragedy happening in the future. What happened in Benghazi has been scrutinized by a nonpartisan, hard-hitting accountability review board, 7 prior congressional investigations, multiple news organizations, and of course, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So today, I would like to share 3 observations about how we can learn from this tragedy and move forward as a nation. First, America must lead in a dangerous world, and our diplomats must continue representing us in dangerous places. The State Department sends people to more than 270 posts in 170 countries around the world. Chris Stevens understood that diplomats must operate in many places where our soldiers do not, where there are no other boots on the ground and safety is far from guaranteed. In fact, he volunteered for just those assignments. He also understood we will never prevent every act of terrorism or achieve perfect security, and that we inevitably must accept a level of risk to protect our country and advance our interests and values. And make no mistake, the risks are real. Terrorists have killed more than 65 American diplomatic personnel since the 1970s, and more than 100 contractors and locally employed staff. Since 2001, there have been more than 100 attacks on U.S. diplomatic facilities around the world. But if you ask our most experienced ambassadors, they'll tell you they can't do their jobs for us from bunkers. It would compound the tragedy of Benghazi if Chris Stevens' death and the death of the other 3 Americans ended up undermining the work to which he and they devoted their lives. We have learned the hard way, when America is absent, especially from unstable places, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, aggressors seek to fill the vacuum, and security everywhere is threatened, including here at home. That's why Chris was in Benghazi. It's why he had served previously in Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jerusalem during the Second Intifada. Nobody knew the dangers of Libya better. A weak government, extremist groups, rampant instability. But Chris chose to go to Benghazi because he understood America had to be represented there at that pivotal time. He knew that eastern Libya was where the revolution had begun and that unrest there could derail the country's fragile transition to democracy. And if extremists gained a foothold, they would have the chance to destabilize the entire region, including Egypt and Tunisia. He also knew how urgent it was to ensure that the weapons Gaddafi had left strewn across the country, including shoulder-fired missiles that could knock an airplane out of the sky, did not fall into the wrong hands. The nearest Israeli airport is just a day's drive from the Libyan border. Above all, Chris understood that most people in Libya or anywhere reject the extremists' argument that violence can ever be a path to dignity or justice. That's what those thousands of Libyans were saying after they learned of his death. And he understood there was no substitute for going beyond the embassy walls and doing the hard work of building relationships. Retreat from the world is not an option. America cannot shrink from our responsibility to lead. That doesn't mean we should ever return to the go-it-alone foreign policy of the past, a foreign policy that puts boots on the ground as a first choice rather than a last resort. Quite the opposite. We need creative, confident leadership that harnesses all of America's strengths and values. Leadership that integrates and balances the tools of diplomacy, development, and defense. And at the heart of that effort must be dedicated professionals like Chris Stevens and his colleagues, who put their lives on the line for a country, our country, because they believed, as I do, that America is the greatest force for peace and progress the world has ever known. My second observation is this: we have a responsibility to provide our diplomats with the resources and support they need to do their jobs as safely and effectively as possible. After previous deadly attacks, leaders from both parties and both branches of government came together to determine what went wrong and how to fix it for the future. That's in administration. When Hezbollah attacked our embassy and killed 63 people, including 17 Americans, and then in a later attacked our Marine barracks and killed so many more. Those two attacks in Beirut resulted in the deaths of 208 Americans. It's what happened during the Clinton administration when Al-Qaeda bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing more than 200 people, wounding more than 2,000 people, and killing 12 Americans. And it's what happened during the Bush administration after 9/11. Part of America's strength is we learn, we adapt, and we get stronger. After the Benghazi attacks, I asked Ambassador Thomas Pickering, one of our most distinguished and longest serving diplomats, along with Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff appointed by President George W. Bush, to lead an accountability review board. This is an institution that the Congress set up after the terrible attacks in Beirut. There have been 18 previous accountability review boards. Only 2 have ever made any of their findings public. The one following the attacks on our embassies in East Africa, and the one following the attack on Benghazi. The